Students still talk about the day the balance of fear shifted forever. A bully believed he owned the room, but the person he underestimated most revealed a past that made his arrogance look small. What followed wasn't just a clash between teacher and student, but a revelation that shattered illusions and left the entire school changed. If you want more powerful stories like this, remember to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are tuning in from and what part caught your attention. In Jefferson High School, the day began with the usual rhythm of chatter, hurried footsteps, and the clatter of lockers. But for one classroom, everything ordinary was about to shatter. The chemistry lab smelled faintly of ammonia and chalk dust. Students hunched over their notebooks while burners hissed and beakers simmered. Yet underneath the routine lingered an unspoken tension between Brandon Cole, the wealthy and arrogant son of a powerful businessman, and Miss Aisha Johnson, the new black teacher who had walked into Jefferson High only 3 months earlier, but carried herself with the authority of someone who had weathered storms far greater than spoiled teenagers. She was in her late 30s, tall with sharp eyes and a posture so precise that it reminded some of a soldier on parade. Her presence commanded respect without raising her voice, and it made Brandon furious because he thrived on control, fear, and mocking those who seemed vulnerable. From the very first day, he had tried to humiliate her, making jokes about her strictness, whispering slurs under his breath, and bragging that no teacher could touch him because his father practically paid the salaries of half the staff. The whispers around school had always painted Brandon as untouchable, the bully protected by wealth. Yet Aisha Johnson was different. She was black, disciplined, and unshaken by the arrogance he carried like a crown. That morning, Brandon slouched at the back table, smirking at his friends while ignoring the experiment in front of him. He whispered crude remarks about Miss Johnson's clothes, suggesting she was playing dress-up rather than teaching science. His voice carried across the lab, forcing uncomfortable chuckles from his clique, but Miss Johnson never faltered. She walked past their table without even glancing at him, eyes fixed on another group whose solution bubbled dangerously close to overflow. "Lower the flame," she instructed calmly, her tone precise, measured, and indifferent to his taunt. The dismissal cut deeper than an insult, for Brandon lived to provoke and dominate. Being ignored, especially by a black woman he thought beneath him, was unbearable. He slammed his notebook closed, the sharp crack silencing the hum of conversation. Every eye turned toward him as he rose, shoulders squared in challenge. "Don't tell me what to do," he barked, his voice echoing against the tiled walls. "You're not my boss, my dad pays your salary." Nervous laughter rippled through the class, some students shifting in their chairs, others looking down to avoid his gaze. The air thickened with dread because everyone knew Brandon was testing her in a way no teacher dared resist. But Miss Johnson did not blink. Slowly, she turned toward him, and her dark eyes locked on his with an intensity that made even the bravest students feel like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. "In this classroom," she said firmly, "discipline rules, not money. Sit down." The words were sharp as glass, final as a gavel, and for a brief moment Brandon's confidence faltered. His heartbeat quickened, though he forced a crooked smile to cover it. Pride poisoned his thoughts. His friends were watching, and so was the entire class. If he backed down, he would lose the control he had spent years building. He took a step forward, sneering. "Or what?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly but masked with bravado. His broad frame loomed, his smirk returned, and his chest puffed out as if daring her to act. Students held their breath, sensing they stood on the edge of something irreversible. It happened in a heartbeat. Fueled by rage and humiliation, Brandon lunged across the space between them, his hand snapping up to seize her throat. The motion was sudden, violent, and born of a lifetime of never facing consequences. The impact shoved her against the counter, rattling the glassware, sending a flask rolling across the floor, and a burner's flame flickering dangerously close to spilling liquid. Gas hissed from a disturbed valve, mixing with the cries of shock that erupted from the class. Some students leaped from their chairs, one dropped his phone in panic, while another fumbled to hit record, but no one dared move closer. Brandon's grip tightened, his face twisted into smug triumph, eyes alight with cruel satisfaction. This was his stage, his proof of dominance over the one adult who had refused to bend. Leaning in, his voice dripped venom. "What now? Huh? What are you going to do now?" His arrogance pulsed through every syllable. convinced that his father's influence could shield him from whatever aftermath followed. But Miss Johnson did not panic. Her eyes, framed by calm strength, did not widen in fear, but narrowed in measured focus, and in that frozen instant, something far more dangerous than Brandon's wealth or temper revealed itself. Those eyes spoke of deserts and battlefields, of survival forged in fire, of training that ordinary teachers never endured. Her hands remained still, not yet striking, but her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, like a soldier preparing for a counterattack. The students closest to her recognized it before Brandon did. The black woman pinned against the counter was not helpless. She was waiting, calculating, measuring the exact second to unleash something no spoiled bully could ever expect. The lab, heavy with chemical fumes and silence, felt suspended in time. Every sound, the hiss of gas, the rattle of glass, the shallow breaths of terrified teenagers seemed magnified, amplified, unbearable. Some students prayed, someone would intervene, others silently willed her to fight back, but no one spoke. All they could do was watch as the boy who had always seemed untouchable finally pushed too far. Miss Aisha Johnson stood in the aftermath of the shocking assault with Brandon's hand still lingering in her memory, her throat sore but her resolve unbroken, and as the students slowly shuffled out of the chemistry lab with whispers bouncing off the hallway walls, she adjusted her blouse cuffs and carried herself with the same precise composure she had always shown, yet inside her mind a flood of old instincts stirred. She was a black woman who had learned long ago that survival depended not only on discipline but on preparation, and as she walked back to her desk and calmly stacked the scattered notebooks and glassware that had fallen during the chaos, her thoughts traveled back to the years before Jefferson High, years no one in this building could imagine. Students at the school gossiped endlessly about her, saying she was too strict, too distant, too cold, whispering rumors that she had lived another life before becoming a teacher, but none of them truly understood that those rumors were closer to the truth than they could ever guess. Aisha had grown up in a neighborhood where respect was demanded, not requested, and her father, a former Marine who had fought in conflicts overseas, raised her and her brothers with the same regimented code he had learned in uniform. From childhood, she had been drilled to keep her back straight, her eyes forward, and never show weakness. And when her teenage years tested her with street confrontations and systemic prejudice, she leaned on those lessons to rise above. Later, when she enlisted herself, she endured boot camps and deployments that hardened her body and mind in ways that her current students could not even comprehend, standing guard in desert heat, navigating ambushes, and watching fellow soldiers fall. Each scar, both visible and hidden, taught her to remain calm under pressure, to never allow fear to dictate action, and to understand that silence was often more powerful than shouting. Her return to civilian life had been marked by a choice to teach, a decision many of her military comrades questioned, yet she saw it as another battlefield won where the enemy was ignorance and arrogance, and where the victories came not with medals but with the transformation of young minds. Still, she knew stepping into a suburban school as a black woman with military discipline would not be easy. Parents whispered that she was too severe. Students rolled their eyes at her strict rules, and teachers wondered aloud why she never laughed in the break room. But Aisha carried herself with the same unyielding code she had always known. Respect is not given freely. It is earned through consistency, strength, and presence. Brandon Cole represented the precise kind of arrogance she had encountered countless times before. Privileged, emboldened by his father's wealth, and accustomed to bending rules without consequence. She had recognized his type on her very first day when he leaned against a locker with that smug grin, whispering crude comments to his friends while shoving smaller kids out of the way. Aisha had not been surprised. Bullies were universal, existing in every unit she had ever served with, and she had learned that their weakness was not their loud voice or their violent gestures, but the hollow foundation of fear they buried beneath the surface. As she sat at her desk in the silent lab after the attack, she recalled the way Brandon's hand had tightened on her throat, the arrogant words he had spat in her face, and she realized how dangerous it could have been, not only for her but for every student in that room. The hiss of gas had almost triggered an explosion, and had she not kept her composure, had panic overtaken her, they might all have been injured or worse. That thought solidified her resolve this was not simply about a boy lashing out, It was about a culture of entitlement that had been allowed to flourish unchecked, and it was her duty, as both a teacher and as a veteran, to confront it. She knew Brandon's father would try to protect him, the school board would hesitate to punish him, and the principal would likely advise her to let it go, but Aisha Johnson was not someone who stepped back when challenged. Her life had been forged in environments where retreat was not an option, and she carried that discipline into every aspect of her current role. The rumors students whispered in the halls about why she wore long sleeves even in summer, about her soldier-like posture, about her piercing gaze were all pieces of a puzzle they could not put together. They thought she was divorced or perhaps lonely, but the truth was simpler. She had seen too much, lost too many, and carried the kind of scars that demanded privacy. The discipline in her posture, the quiet strength in her eyes, the refusal to engage in gossip, all of it stemmed from years of training and loss that taught her emotions were best kept in check, because the world was rarely merciful to those who showed vulnerability. As she locked the lab door and walked through the crowded hallway, students stared at her in hushed awe. Word of the confrontation was already spreading like wildfire. Some looked at her with newfound respect, others with fear, but none with the casual disregard they had once shown. Brandon himself limped away down another corridor, cradling his arm, his swagger broken for the first time in memory. Aisha's mind, however, was not focused on his humiliation, but on the bigger picture. The school had just witnessed a glimpse of who she really was, and it would change the way they saw her forever. She had kept her composure, revealed only enough to defend herself, but she knew the questions would grow louder. What had Miss Johnson done before she became a teacher? Why had she moved with such precision, such speed, as though she had been trained for combat? Why had her calm under assault felt more terrifying than anger? These whispers would follow her now, just as whispers had followed her through every phase of her life. But she was ready. She had always been ready. The students thought she was just another black teacher, trying to enforce discipline in a school dominated by privilege, but she carried an entire past that none of them could guess. That past was not a weakness, not a chain, but a weapon. One she had learned to keep hidden until moments like this demanded its use. Brandon Cole walked through the hallways of Jefferson High with his injured arm held stiffly against his side, his face pale from the humiliation he had endured in front of his classmates. But though he had been shaken in the lab, the arrogance that defined him did not dissolve completely because arrogance had been built into his life from the very beginning. He was the only son of Richard Cole, a man whose real estate empire sprawled across the city like a net, pulling strings in school boards, funding campaigns, and keeping officials loyal with carefully written checks. From the moment Brandon first set foot in Jefferson High, teachers had whispered warnings to each other. Don't provoke him, don't discipline him too harshly, because his father could call the principal or the superintendent with a single phone call and make their lives miserable. This shield of influence had insulated Brandon for years, allowing him to terrorize other students with pranks, shoves, insults, and threats, while administrators looked the other way. His bullying was not just tolerated but indirectly sanctioned by a system too fearful of losing donations. Brandon understood this dynamic and exploited it with the cruelty of someone who never learned limits. He had a reputation for shoving smaller kids into lockers, mocking those who stuttered or struggled with reading, and spreading rumors that could destroy reputations in days. Teachers who attempted to discipline him often found themselves summoned into the principal's office and lectured about maintaining balance and avoiding conflicts with donors, code phrases that meant they were expected to let Brandon's actions slide. Even the custodial staff knew to walk away when he spilled drinks or smashed equipment, because complaining would only cost them their jobs. Among the student body, he was feared not because he was strong or brilliant, but because no one wanted to become his target. Every student had seen what happened to those who challenged him: relentless teasing, social isolation, sometimes even physical aggression. Parents complained quietly to each other in carpool lines, but rarely brought it to the school, because they too understood Richard Cole's power. Ms. Aisha Johnson had noticed Brandon's patterns from the first week she taught at Jefferson. She had recognized his smirk when he mocked weaker classmates, the way he carried himself like he owned the hallway, the subtle intimidation that silenced others. Her own background allowed her to see through the facade. Beneath the bravado and the constant testing of boundaries was a boy addicted to power because he had never been denied it. He reminded her of arrogant recruits she had encountered during her time in service, men who believed their family's wealth or their physical size made them untouchable, until discipline and training broke them down to reveal their vulnerability. Brandon, however, had never been broken down. He had been protected, shielded, and allowed to flourish unchecked. The assault in the lab had shaken him, but it had not erased the foundation of entitlement. As he walked away from class, clutching his arm, whispers chased him. Students dared to laugh quietly for the first time, realizing that he had been bested. But Brandon's pride twisted those whispers into rage. He hated that they had seen him lose control, that they had witnessed a black woman reducing him from predator to prey in mere seconds. He hated most of all that for the first time in his life, the shield of his father's money had not saved him. Instead of learning humility, his mind churned with plans for revenge. Meanwhile, teachers gathered in the faculty lounge, already hearing fragments of what had happened. Some were quietly relieved that someone had stood up to Brandon. Others worried about what his father would do when he found out. The principal, Mr. Hardwick, sat in his office sweating over the inevitable phone call he would receive, already drafting vague explanations to protect the school's funding. But Miss Johnson, seated at her desk with her lesson plans neatly stacked, did not think about Richard Cole's influence or the administrator's cowardice. She thought only of the classroom, of the gas valve that nearly exploded, of the terrified students who had watched everything unfold. Her duty was not to placate a bully's father, but to ensure that every child in her room understood discipline, safety, and respect. The truth was that Brandon had grown used to manipulating every adult he encountered, from teachers to coaches to even his own mother, who often excused his behavior as boys being boys. He thrived on intimidation, on seeing fear in others' eyes, and that was why Miss Johnson's calm defiance infuriated him more than any punishment ever could. She had not raised her voice, had not shown fear, had not given him the satisfaction of recognition. She had dismantled him with silence, precision, and strength, and that contradiction gnawed at him. His friends tried to reassure him, whispering that they would spread rumors claiming Miss Johnson had overreacted, but deep inside, Brandon knew the truth. His image as untouchable had been fractured, and once cracks appear, others start to push. At home that evening, he sat at the dinner table across from his father, who sipped whiskey and listened quietly as Brandon recounted the incident with exaggeration, claiming Miss Johnson had attacked him without reason. Richard Cole frowned, promised his son he would handle it, and dialed a number on his phone before dessert was served. That was the way power had always worked in Brandon's life. Problems vanished because someone else made a call, pulled a string, or threatened a consequence. Yet this time, even as his father spoke into the phone with commanding authority, Brandon could not erase the memory of Miss Johnson's eyes staring into his, calm and unflinching, as though she had already measured him and found him lacking. The next morning, Jefferson High buzzed with rumors, the whispers of Brandon Cole's humiliation traveling faster than any official statement could. In the cafeteria, students leaned over their trays, whispering about how the arrogant bully who had once pushed freshmen into lockers had been bent against a counter by Miss Aisha Johnson, the black teacher who never flinched. In the gym, the basketball team replayed the story with exaggerated motions, some laughing under their breath, others still too cautious to believe that Brandon's reign of intimidation might be over. But in the chemistry lab, where the air still carried faint traces of scorched chemicals from yesterday's chaos, Miss Johnson prepared her lesson with the same calm discipline as always. She stood tall, her posture precise, her long sleeves hiding the faint red mark on her throat that reminded her of Brandon's hand. She was not the kind of woman to wear scars for sympathy, but she was aware that every student who entered the room that morning would be looking for a sign, some clue as to how she would respond to the whispers and the stares. She had learned in her years of service that leadership required consistency, and so she made no mention of the assault. Instead, she wrote the day's experiment instructions on the board in neat chalk letters, her voice steady as she greeted the class and told them to take their seats. The students filed in more quietly than usual, their eyes darting between her and Brandon, who arrived late, his arm still stiff from her grip, his face pale but defiant. He slumped into his seat, his friends flanking him like nervous shadows, and for a brief moment the classroom held its breath. Miss Johnson continued the lesson, her instructions clipped and precise, but everyone knew the confrontation was not finished. Brandon tapped his pen against the desk, his jaw tight, his pride still bleeding from the night before. He had overheard students mocking him in the hallway, their words cutting deeper than he cared to admit. For the first time in his life, he had felt powerless, and he could not bear the idea that the entire school saw him as weak. So he tried again. As the class measured out chemicals, Brandon raised his voice, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, Miss Johnson," he sneered. "Are you really a teacher or just playing dress up until you find a real job?" His words dripped with venom, and his friends laughed nervously, but the sound felt forced. Students shifted uncomfortably, waiting for her reaction, aware that they were standing once again on the edge of something dangerous. Miss Johnson did not flinch. She turned slightly, her eyes sweeping the room before landing on the experiment bubbling at Brandon's station. Without raising her voice, she said, "Focus on your solution, Brandon. It's about to overheat." The calmness of her response struck harder than any insult, and a few students smirked quietly, recognizing that she had dismissed him with a single sentence. Brandon's face flushed red, the laughter of his friends dying in their throats. He slammed his notebook shut, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. "Don't tell me what to do!" he snapped, his voice sharp, desperate to reclaim authority. "My dad pays your salary. You should remember that before you talk to me like that." The words hung in the air like poison, and the class fell into silence, the weight of entitlement pressing down on everyone present. Miss Johnson's eyes locked on his, cold and steady, her tone deliberate. "Your father doesn't run this classroom," she said. "Science does. Discipline does. Sit down." The authority in her voice was undeniable, carrying the weight of years of command and control, and for the first time in his life, Brandon felt his confidence waver in front of his peers. But pride was a dangerous thing, and he could not allow himself to back down. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and leaned forward with a smirk that tried to mask his fear. "Or what?" he demanded. His friends stared in silence, their laughter gone, the rest of the class frozen in anticipation. They had never seen a teacher stand so firmly against him, and the moment became more than just a classroom conflict. It was a trial of power, and everyone was waiting for the verdict. Miss Johnson's posture did not change, but her eyes sharpened like steel. Her voice dropped, calm but edged with warning. "Sit down, Brandon." The authority in her words pressed against him like a weight, but he ignored it, too blinded by the fear of appearing weak. He leaned closer, ready to spit another insult, but the silence of the class suffocated him. For once, no one cheered him on, no one encouraged him, and the realization only stoked his anger further. He grabbed the nearest notebook and hurled it onto the floor with a loud crack, the sound reverberating through the lab. Gas hissed faintly from a disturbed valve, and a few students gasped. He smirked again, feeding on the tension, certain that his aggression would restore the fear he had lost. But it didn't. The students looked not at him but at Miss Johnson, their expressions a mixture of awe and fear, waiting for her to respond. She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his, and for the briefest moment, Brandon saw something in her gaze that terrified him. It was not anger, not fear, but a calm that suggested she had faced men stronger and crueler than him, and had walked away unbroken. He swallowed hard, but his pride pushed him further, his voice cracking as he shouted, "What are you going to do if I don't sit down?" His words echoed, but the silence that followed was louder. The humiliation was not in her response, but in her restraint. She had stripped him of power not by fighting, but by refusing to give him the recognition he craved. The silence that followed Brandon Cole's failed attempt to regain dominance in the chemistry lab weighed heavily on every student, their eyes darting between his trembling form and Miss Aisha Johnson's calm stance. And though the tension from the previous day's assault still lingered in their memories, none of them could have predicted that Brandon's desperation would soon push him across a line he could never uncross. Brandon had built his identity on fear, and fear depended on performance. So with his friends watching and his pride bleeding out in the quiet classroom, he decided that humiliation could only be erased by escalation. He straightened his shoulders, forcing a smirk back onto his face, though his flushed cheeks betrayed his rage, and he leaned forward on his desk with a voice that trembled but carried across the room. "You think you're in charge here? You think because you embarrassed me yesterday that you're safe?" The words, intended to sound threatening, instead rang hollow, a desperate grasp for control, and his classmates shifted uncomfortably, sensing the fragility beneath the bluster. Miss Johnson's eyes locked on him, sharp and steady, her voice even. "Sit down, Brandon. You're finished." That phrase, so final, so dismissive, stabbed at his pride more than any punishment could. He could feel the power he had always wielded slipping from his hands, and his father's name, his shield, suddenly seemed flimsy in the presence of her authority. His friends, once eager to laugh at his every joke, now stared at the floor, unwilling to share in his downfall. That abandonment filled him with fury, and in his rage, Brandon slammed his fist against the desk, startling the class. "No one tells me I'm finished," he spat, his voice cracking under the weight of his desperation. Miss Johnson remained unflinching, her posture unchanged, but deep inside she recognized the danger. She had seen this before, in soldiers who had been stripped of their false bravado, men who lashed out violently when their weakness was exposed, and she knew that Brandon was teetering on that precipice. The students sat rigid, their breaths held, waiting to see what he would do next, and Brandon, blinded by humiliation, made his choice. He pushed back his chair so hard that it toppled to the floor with a screeching clang, and he stepped forward, his fists clenched, his chest heaving as he glared at her with wild eyes. "If you think you can talk to me like that, you've got another thing coming," he growled. And in that moment, he was no longer simply a spoiled bully. He was a young man spiraling out of control, willing to risk anything to claw back the image of power he had lost. The room seemed to shrink as he advanced, every student shrinking into their seats, and Miss Johnson, though calm, prepared herself mentally. She had been trained for threats like this, had faced worse in the heat of combat, and she knew that fear was her enemy now. She straightened, her voice carrying across the room, low and deliberate. "Brandon, take one more step and you'll regret it." Her words were not shouted, not frantic, but carried the weight of certainty, and they hung in the air like a wall he could not see but could feel pressing against him. Brandon hesitated, his pride wrestling with the instinctive unease that rippled down his spine, but pride won out, and he lunged forward, closing the distance between them. The gasp from the class was deafening. In that single reckless move, Brandon shattered whatever remnants of protection he thought his father's money could provide. He grabbed at her arm, trying to yank her forward, but Miss Johnson's training took over in an instant. With precision honed through years of discipline, she twisted his wrist, locking it in a grip of iron that made him cry out in pain. The students froze, wide-eyed, as Brandon's face contorted, his arrogance collapsing into panic as he struggled against her hold. She pivoted smoothly, guiding his momentum into the counter, slamming him against it with controlled force that rattled the beakers but left nothing broken except his pride. His friends flinched but remained frozen, unwilling to intervene, and Brandon's struggle grew more frantic as the reality sank in. He had no control, no power, no escape. Miss Johnson's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried across the room with terrifying clarity. "This is your last warning." Brandon, pinned and gasping, tried to speak, but the only sound that escaped was a whimper. For the first time in his life, he was not the predator but the prey, trapped in the grip of someone who had seen more, survived more, and refused to bend. His classmates, who had once feared him, now stared in awe at the black teacher who had turned the tables completely, and in that silence, Brandon realized that the fear he had built his empire upon had crumbled to dust. The echo of Brandon Cole's whimper still lingered in the chemistry lab after Miss Aisha Johnson released him, and though she calmly resumed her lesson as if the altercation had been nothing more than a minor disruption, every student in that room sat frozen with the memory of what they had just witnessed. Brandon slouched in his chair, his face pale, his pride shattered, his arm throbbing from the grip she had used to pin him down, but humiliation burned hotter than any physical pain. He clenched his fists under the desk, his thoughts racing with images of classmates whispering about his downfall, the weight of his father's expectations pressing on his shoulders, and the unbearable truth that a black teacher, someone he had been raised to see as beneath him, had stripped him of control twice in front of an audience. Rage and shame boiled together inside him, and as the day dragged on, he convinced himself that the only way to salvage his reputation was to escalate further, to take an action so bold that the class, the school, and even Miss Johnson herself would be forced to fear him again. That decision formed quietly, festering behind his forced smirk, and by the time the final bell rang, Brandon had crossed an invisible line in his mind. Miss Johnson, for her part, carried herself through the remainder of the day with the same discipline she had always shown. She greeted her next classes with calm authority, corrected experiments with precision, and dismissed students with measured words. Yet beneath that exterior, her instincts remained on high alert. She had felt the tension in Brandon's movements, the recklessness in his eyes, and she knew that he was not finished. She had served long enough to recognize that arrogance stripped of its armor often became dangerous, that people who thrived on power rarely surrendered it quietly. As she walked to her car that afternoon, the sun dipping low against the horizon, she scanned the parking lot with the subtle vigilance that had never left her since her deployments. It was a habit born from survival. Always assess, always anticipate, always be ready. She had not wanted to bring the battlefield into Jefferson High, but Brandon's rage was making that impossible. The following morning, the atmosphere at school was heavier than usual. Whispers still trailed through hallways, the story of Brandon's humiliation retold with new details and exaggerations, and though some students felt emboldened by seeing him finally put in his place, others feared the backlash they sensed was coming. Brandon's friends, who once strutted confidently beside him, now walked uneasily at his side, unsure whether to continue supporting him or distance themselves from his crumbling image. Brandon, however, had made up his mind. He arrived in class late, his jaw set, his fists clenched, his mind determined to reclaim control at any cost. When he entered the chemistry lab, the air seemed to shift, the students stiffening at the sight of him, their eyes darting toward Miss Johnson as though to gauge her reaction. She did not flinch. She simply instructed him to take his seat, her voice calm, her eyes unwavering. That calmness was gasoline on the fire of his pride. He sat down with deliberate force, slamming his books onto the desk so loudly that a few students jumped. Throughout the lesson, he muttered under his breath, scribbled nonsense onto his paper, and exchanged hostile looks with Miss Johnson whenever her gaze passed over him. Finally, halfway through the experiment, he acted. He reached across the workstation, deliberately nudging a beaker until it teetered dangerously near the edge. The glass wobbled, chemicals sloshing, and a collective gasp filled the room. "Oops," he said loudly, his smirk returning as he glanced around, daring anyone to laugh. Miss Johnson's eyes narrowed, her tone sharp. "Brandon, stop." But instead of obeying, he pushed further. He rose from his seat, towering over the desk, and with a sudden violent shove, he knocked the beaker to the floor. Glass shattered, liquid splashed, and the acrid scent of chemicals filled the air as a hiss of gas rose from the disturbed burner beside him. Students screamed and scrambled back from their stations, chairs screeching against the floor, the chaos echoing like thunder in the confined space. Brandon spread his arms, his smirk wide, as though daring her to punish him. "What are you going to do now?" he shouted, his voice cracking under the weight of adrenaline. The room erupted into pandemonium, but Miss Johnson did not panic. Her training surged forward, instincts honed by years of crisis management. She barked an order for the students to step back, her voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of a commander. She crossed the room swiftly, her movements precise, shutting off the gas valve with one firm twist of her hand before the hiss could become an explosion. Her eyes locked on Brandon, who still stood defiantly, his chest heaving with anger, but beneath his bravado was a flicker of fear at how quickly she had neutralized the danger he had created. The students stared at her in awe, their terror slowly fading as they realized she had just prevented a disaster. Brandon, however, could not stand the shift of attention. His attempt to dominate the classroom had only highlighted his recklessness, and instead of restoring his power, it had exposed him further. He lunged toward her again, reaching for her arm in desperation, but she sidestepped with fluid precision, catching his wrist and twisting it once more. In seconds, he was on the floor, his face pressed against the cool tile, his arm locked painfully behind his back. His friends froze, their mouths open in disbelief, while the rest of the class whispered in shock. Miss Johnson leaned down, her voice low and steady. "This is not just about you anymore. You endangered everyone in this room." Her words carried the weight of truth, and the students felt it settle into their bones. For the first time, they understood that Brandon was not just a bully, he was a danger. The moment Miss Aisha Johnson pinned Brandon Cole to the floor after his reckless stunt with the chemicals and the hissing gas, a silence unlike any other fell upon the classroom, and though the students had just escaped a potential disaster, their attention was fixed not on the shattered glass or the acrid stench of fumes, but on the black teacher whose movements had been executed with such frightening precision that they could no longer deny she was far more than the ordinary. teacher she appeared to be. Brandon groaned beneath her hold, his arm twisted behind his back, his cheek pressed against the cool tile, his arrogance crushed beneath her calm authority. And though she released him once the danger had been neutralized, the image of his submission burned itself into the minds of every student present. He staggered to his feet afterward, humiliated, his pride shattered. But Aisha did not spare him another glance as she calmly ordered the students to exit, her voice carrying the weight of unshakable discipline. That composure, that unflinching calm, unsettled them all more deeply than raised voices or threats ever could, because it was the calm of someone who had seen worse, someone who had been trained for crisis, someone whose strength had been forged in fire. As word spread through Jefferson High in the hours that followed, whispers about the incident took on new dimensions. Students who had witnessed the confrontation struggled to describe what they had seen, but they all agreed on one thing. Miss Johnson's movements had been too sharp, too fluid, too deliberate for a mere teacher. She had turned Brandon's momentum against him with the efficiency of someone who had done it countless times before, and her control under pressure was unlike anything they had ever encountered. By the time lunch arrived, the rumors had evolved from simple retellings into wild theories. Some claimed she had once been a police officer. Others insisted she had trained in martial arts for years, and a few whispered the most sensational rumor of all that she had served in the military. To the students of Jefferson High, it was an intoxicating thought, because it meant the strict, cold black woman who had always commanded the room was not simply strict by nature, but disciplined by experience, molded by battles beyond the school walls. Brandon, meanwhile, sat hunched in the cafeteria, nursing his bruised ego and ignoring the sympathetic murmurs of his friends, who themselves were too shaken to laugh. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the pitying looks of some, the smirks of others, and worst of all, the whispers that carried just loud enough for him to hear. They were no longer afraid of him, they were afraid of her. That realization struck harder than her grip on his wrist. And for the first time in his life, Brandon felt the suffocating grip of irrelevance pressing down on him. He clenched his fist and muttered curses under his breath, promising himself that he would find a way to restore his dominance. But deep inside, a seed of fear had been planted, one he could not uproot. Miss Johnson remained quiet throughout the day, moving from class to class with the same measured pace, answering questions, guiding experiments, and never once acknowledging the storm of rumors swirling around her. She had learned long ago that speculation was a weapon that often destroyed itself. Still, as she walked the hallways, she could feel the shift in the air. Students who once rolled their eyes now straightened when she passed, their voices lowering, their gazes avoiding direct contact. It was not just respect, it was awe. Some of them even seemed proud, whispering among themselves that she had finally broken the school's most notorious bully, but others looked at her with a new wariness, as though they feared she might turn that precision on them. Aisha accepted both reactions with the same stoic grace, for she had not chosen this confrontation, but she understood that it had revealed part of herself she had long kept hidden. That evening, as she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling beside her, she reflected on what had happened. She had joined the military years ago not because she sought glory, but because discipline and service had been ingrained in her since childhood. She had worn the uniform, trained under grueling conditions, deployed overseas, and carried with her the lessons of sacrifice and survival. Those experiences had shaped her into the woman she was now, one who could not be intimidated by entitled boys or silenced by wealthy fathers. Yet she had never wanted her past to define her role at Jefferson High. She had chosen teaching because she wanted to build, not break, to nurture, not fight. Still, she understood that her past could not remain hidden forever, and the events in the chemistry lab had torn back the curtain in ways she had not intended. The next morning, the whispers exploded into open conversations. Students crowded lockers and corners of the hallway, debating whether Miss Johnson had served in the Army, the Navy, or even Special Forces. Some swore they had overheard teachers confirming it, though no such conversation had occurred. A few dared to approach her directly, asking timidly if the rumors were true. She offered no confirmation, but the faint smile that played across her lips when asked only fueled the speculation further. For the students, the mystery was irresistible, and for Brandon, it was unbearable. Each time he heard someone praise her composure, each time he heard the word soldier whispered with admiration, his humiliation deepened. The school that had once feared him now celebrated her, and that reversal drove him into a rage he could barely contain. In the teacher's lounge, her colleagues were no less curious. Some asked her directly if she had served, their tones a mixture of admiration and concern. But Aisha gave the same answer she gave the students: silence or a simple change of subject. Yet even in silence, her reputation grew. She had become not just a teacher but a figure larger than the classroom, someone who embodied resilience, authority, and mystery. To her fellow teachers, she was proof that discipline could still command respect in a system too often eroded by privilege. To the students, she was a revelation, a living contradiction to the idea that money and arrogance always won. And to Brandon, she was an unmovable wall, a reminder of his defeat. The cafeteria buzzed with an energy Jefferson High had never felt before. The name of Miss Aisha Johnson whispered from table to table with a mix of fear, admiration, and curiosity. And though she had offered no words to confirm or deny the rumors about her past, the spectacle of her actions against Brandon Cole had been enough to carve her reputation into the very walls of the school. Brandon sat hunched at his usual table, his once faithful circle of friends now reluctant shadows, their laughter absent, their loyalty crumbling under the weight of his repeated humiliations. Every whisper he overheard cut like glass. Every mention of Miss Johnson's calm precision or military-like composure deepened the wound of his pride. And though he tried to scowl and sneer, the truth pressed down on him. He was losing his grip not only on his classmates but on himself. Pride was the currency he had always traded in. Fear was the weapon he had always wielded. And now both had been stripped from him by the black teacher he had mocked and underestimated. By the next day, the school's atmosphere had shifted entirely. Students who once bowed to Brandon's intimidation now walked past him without fear, their eyes darting instead to Miss Johnson whenever she entered the room. Teachers, too, carried themselves differently around her, some emboldened by the example she had set, others wary of the influence she now commanded. She did not seek their attention, did not revel in the whispers, but her steady stride and unflinching gaze only reinforced the aura surrounding her. Brandon, unable to tolerate the silence of his fading power, decided he had to act. If brute force and reckless defiance had failed him, perhaps he could regain authority through spectacle, through forcing her to acknowledge him in front of everyone. In the chemistry lab that morning, he slouched at his workstation, his mind brewing with a dangerous plan. As Miss Johnson guided the class through their lesson, Brandon raised his hand, his smirk returning, and spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "Miss Johnson," he said, his tone laced with mockery, "if you're such a soldier like everyone says, maybe you should be teaching us how to fight instead of mixing chemicals." A wave of gasps rippled across the room. The rumor that she had a military past had been whispered for days, but no one had dared to confront her directly. Brandon's words broke the unspoken rule, dragging her silence into the harsh light of challenge. The class froze, their eyes darting to her, waiting to see how she would respond. Miss Johnson turned slowly, her expression unchanged, her eyes locking on his with the same piercing steadiness she had shown since the first day. "Brandon," she said evenly, "focus on your assignment. That is the only fight in this classroom." Her calm dismissal struck harder than any confirmation, for it showed that she would not be baited into spectacle. Brandon's jaw tightened, his smirk faltering, but his pride would not allow him to stop. He rose from his seat, his tall frame towering over the desk, his voice growing louder. "No, you don't get to brush me off. Everyone here wants to know, are you hiding something? Are you really a teacher, or are you just some soldier who couldn't make it anywhere else?" The words landed like blows, cruel and desperate, designed to turn her silence into weakness. But Miss Johnson did not flinch. She stepped forward, her voice calm yet heavy with authority. "Sit down, Brandon, now." The command cut through the air like a whip, and the student shifted nervously, sensing that another confrontation was about to erupt. Brandon, fueled by humiliation and emboldened by his own desperation, took another step forward, knocking his chair to the ground. "Or what?" he demanded, his voice cracking under the weight of his defiance. His friends sat frozen, unwilling to intervene, while the rest of the class sat rigid, their breaths held, their eyes wide. Miss Johnson's gaze did not waver. She walked toward him with slow, deliberate steps, the kind that carried inevitability. Brandon's bravado faltered as she closed the distance, but his pride forced him to stand his ground. When she reached him, she did not strike, did not raise her voice. Instead, She extended her hand toward the open notebook lying on his desk. She lifted it calmly and turned it around for the class to see. The pages were empty. His assignments had not been completed, his experiments neglected, his education abandoned in favor of arrogance. She held the notebook aloft for all to see, and the silence of the room grew heavier. "This," she said clearly, "is what Brandon Cole brings to this classroom. Nothing. He mocks discipline, he rejects learning, and he endangers everyone with his recklessness. This is his legacy." The humiliation was devastating. Brandon's face turned crimson as the class murmured, their eyes no longer filled with fear but with recognition of his emptiness. The fear he had built his identity upon dissolved completely, replaced with the harsh truth Miss Johnson had exposed. His power had never been strength or intelligence. It had been illusion, sustained only by entitlement and intimidation. Now that illusion lay shattered in front of everyone. He lunged forward, trying to snatch the notebook from her hands, but she pulled it away with ease, her movements as precise as ever. She leaned closer, her voice low enough for him to hear but loud enough for the class to sense. "Power isn't inherited, Brandon. It's earned, and you've earned nothing." His knees weakened under the weight of her words, his fists trembling at his sides, but he could not speak. His voice caught in his throat, choked by the truth he could not deny. Miss Johnson placed the notebook calmly back on his desk and turned to the class. "Return to your work," she ordered, and without hesitation the students obeyed. Brandon stood frozen, his pride bleeding out, his authority stripped completely, his friends avoiding his eyes. He had been reduced to what he truly was. A boy, desperate and small, dwarfed by the calm strength of a woman he could never overpower. Brandon Cole stumbled out of the chemistry lab after Miss Aisha Johnson stripped away the last fragments of his pride, his empty notebook still lying on the desk like an open indictment of everything he had failed to become. And though he tried to puff out his chest and act as if the humiliation had not broken him, the whispers that followed him through the hallway told the truth he could not deny. His empire of fear had collapsed, the loyalty of his friends dissolved into avoidance, and the once ever-present aura of invincibility had been replaced by a new identity. A joke, a warning, a living example of what happens when arrogance collides with discipline. Students who had once lowered their eyes when he passed now dared to meet his gaze, some even smirking as he limped past, while others muttered just loud enough for him to hear, their words cutting deeper than any fist could. He clenched his teeth, rage bubbling inside him, but no matter how tightly he held onto his anger, the truth was undeniable: he had fallen, and there was no path back to the throne he had lost. In the cafeteria the next day, Brandon sat alone for the first time in years. His friends had scattered to other tables, their loyalty evaporating in the face of his weakness, their nervous laughter directed elsewhere. He poked at his food, his jaw set in bitterness, but the silence surrounding him was louder than any insult. Across the room, students leaned together, whispering about the black teacher who had defeated him not once, not twice, but repeatedly, each time revealing another layer of his fragility. They spoke her name with respect, even awe, and for Brandon that was the deepest cut of all. The fear that had once been his shield had migrated to her, and the respect he had demanded through intimidation now flowed toward her naturally, earned by her calm authority and unwavering strength. He looked down at his tray, his appetite gone, his hands trembling with frustration, and for the first time in his life he felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him like chains. Meanwhile, Miss Johnson walked the hallways with the same composure as always, her posture perfect, her eyes sharp, her presence commanding. She had not gloated, had not celebrated his humiliation, but simply continued her duties with discipline, and that restraint only deepened the respect students felt toward her. She had shown them that strength was not in loudness or violence, but in consistency, in the ability to stand firm when others crumbled. Teachers began to notice the change as well. Classrooms grew quieter, students paid more attention, and even those who had once tested boundaries seemed wary of pushing too far. It was as if the entire school had absorbed a lesson from the spectacle. Arrogance is temporary, but respect is lasting when it is earned. Brandon, however, could not accept the shift. He spent long hours in his room at home, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in which Miss Johnson had bested him. He remembered her calm gaze when he had shouted, the precision of her movements when she had subdued him, the devastating simplicity of her words when she had exposed his failures. Each memory gnawed at him, a reminder of the truth he wanted desperately to erase. His father tried to intervene, storming into the principal's office with threats of lawsuits and withdrawn donations, but even the administration, usually quick to bow to Richard Cole's power, hesitated this time. The story had spread too far, the students had witnessed too much, and the whispers of parents who heard the rumors from their children were beginning to surface. The power Richard Cole had always wielded seemed weaker now, eroded by the undeniable reality of what had occurred inside that classroom. Brandon tried to reclaim his status with bluster. He mocked younger students in the hallways, shoved one boy against a locker, and spread rumors about Miss Johnson, but the effect was gone. The younger boy had stared back at him without fear, and the rumor about Miss Johnson being unstable only made students laugh at Brandon's desperation. Each attempt to restore his image only deepened the pit he had fallen into, and by the end of the week, even the teachers, who had once looked the other way, regarded him with open disdain. He was no longer the untouchable bully. He was the pitiful figure clinging to scraps of a reputation that had already been destroyed. For Miss Johnson, the situation brought new challenges. She never sought to become a figure of legend in the school, but she understood the responsibility that now rested on her shoulders. The students watched her more closely, listened more intently, and began to mirror her discipline. She had become not just a teacher, but an example. And though she carried the burden quietly, she did not shrink from it. Her past had taught her that leadership was not about choice, but necessity. And when the moment arrived, you either rose to it or faltered. She had risen, and the students saw it. The turning point came when Brandon attempted one final desperate act to salvage his pride. During a crowded passing period, he blocked Miss Johnson's path in the hallway, his friends lingering at a distance, watching nervously. He squared his shoulders, his voice low but trembling. "This isn't over," he muttered, his eyes darting to the watching crowd. But before he could say more, Miss Johnson stepped closer, her voice calm but filled with unshakable certainty. "It's over, Brandon. Everyone here knows it but you." Her words struck harder than any physical blow, and the silence of the hallway confirmed it. Students watched, their eyes wide, and Brandon realized in that moment that his power had truly evaporated. No one feared him, no one respected him, and no one would ever follow him again. He stepped aside, his shoulders slumping, his pride broken beyond repair. The crowd dispersed, murmurs filling the air, but none of them carried his name with fear anymore. They carried hers, spoken with respect, admiration, and awe. Miss Johnson continued walking, her stride steady, her gaze forward, never looking back at the boy who had once believed himself untouchable. The fall of Brandon Cole was not a moment contained within a single classroom or a fleeting rumor whispered between students. It was a transformation that rippled through every corridor of Jefferson High, reshaping the way students and teachers alike understood strength, discipline, and respect. And at the center of that transformation stood Miss Aisha Johnson, the black teacher who had never sought power or recognition, but had instead carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had already walked through fire and survived. After the final confrontation in the hallway, where she told Brandon with calm certainty that it was over, the whispers that once carried fear of him began to carry admiration of her, and the myth of the untouchable bully dissolved into nothing more than a cautionary tale. Brandon himself became a shadow of the boy he had once been, his swagger gone, his circle of friends dispersed, his place at the top of the school's social hierarchy erased by his own arrogance and by the unshakable resolve of the teacher he had underestimated. He walked the halls with his head down now, unable to meet the eyes of those who once trembled at his presence, and though anger still simmered inside him, he had no outlet left to wield it because the one thing he had depended on, fear, had been stripped away completely. Miss Johnson continued to teach with the same composure, her lessons steady, her posture precise, her eyes sharp, and yet the atmosphere of her classroom was transformed, not by anything she said, but by everything she had shown. Students who once slouched or whispered now sat straighter, paying attention, aware that in her presence, laziness and disrespect had no place. Some of them admired her discipline, others feared her precision, but all of them understood that she commanded the room not by shouting or threats, but by an authority that was undeniable, earned, and authentic. In quiet moments, some of the students even wondered what battles she had faced before Jefferson High, what experiences had sharpened her into someone so resilient, but whether she had served in the military or endured hardships elsewhere, they knew that her past was not what defined her. It was the strength she carried into the present. The staff at Jefferson High also felt the shift. Teachers who had once complained about unruly classes found their students calmer, more respectful, as though the ripple of her example extended beyond her own classroom. Some confided to one another that perhaps they had grown too tolerant of arrogance and entitlement, too willing to excuse bad behavior in the face of wealthy parents, and Ms. Johnson's refusal to bend had reminded them of their own responsibilities. Even the principal, who had at first dreaded the phone calls from Richard Cole, realized that the tide of opinion had shifted, that protecting Brandon was no longer feasible when the entire school had seen the truth. Parents began to murmur as well, some praising Ms. Johnson for standing firm, others uneasy about her methods, but even those who disapproved could not deny that the school felt different, stronger, as though a line had been drawn in the sand and discipline had returned. For Brandon, the humiliation was unbearable, yet in the months that followed, something unexpected began to stir inside him. With his shield of fear gone and his father's influence unable to repair his broken reputation, he had no choice but to confront the emptiness Miss Johnson had exposed. His notebooks, once empty, now demanded attention, and though he struggled, he found himself studying late at night, driven less by ambition and more by desperation to prove that he was not entirely worthless. The transformation was not quick, nor was it complete, but it was real, because beneath the arrogance had always been a boy who had never been told no, never been forced to work for respect, and now, stripped of illusions, he began to glimpse the value of effort. Miss Johnson did not coddle him, nor did she ever acknowledge his quiet attempts to change, but her consistency created the space for him to try. In that perhaps lay her greatest strength. She did not merely defeat him, she forced him to face himself. The students of Jefferson High carried the memory of those days with them long after graduation. They spoke of the black teacher who had faced down the untouchable bully and revealed him for what he truly was, and in their memories, she became more than a teacher. She became a symbol of resilience, of dignity, of the truth that respect is not bought with money or fear, but earned through strength and integrity. For some, she was the reason they learned to stand taller. For others, she was the reminder that arrogance will always collapse when confronted with discipline. Years later, when they spoke of their high school days, they did not remember Brandon Cole's smirk or his intimidation. They remembered Miss Johnson's steady gaze, her calm command, and the moment she proved that no amount of wealth or privilege could protect someone from the consequences of their actions. And for Miss Johnson herself, the lesson was one she had known all along, but which had now been written into the lives of everyone around her. That strength is not about domination, that power is not about fear, and that the true measure of a person lies not in what they inherit, but in what they earn. She had never set out to expose Brandon, never sought to humiliate him, but when forced to confront his arrogance, she had stood firm, and in doing so, she had not only protected her students from his recklessness, but also reminded them all that even in a world where money bends rules, there are still people who cannot be bought. The end was not loud or triumphant. It was quiet, meaningful, and lasting. The bully fell, the teacher stood, and the lesson endured. Respect cannot be forced. It cannot be purchased. It cannot be inherited. It must be earned. And once earned, it cannot be stripped away. The end. If you followed this story until the end, you know it was about more than a teacher and a bully. It was about strength, dignity, and the truth that respect cannot be bought. If you want to hear more stories that reveal what happens when arrogance collides with discipline, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. I would love to know what you thought about this plot. Did Brandon's downfall surprise you? Or did you see it coming the moment Miss Johnson refused to bend? And tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because it's always powerful to see how far these stories reach across the world.